Welcome to another episode of Esoteric Artifacts. I'm Subash. This is my co host Glenn. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about the Federal Reserve's recent policy actions, as well as some of the global supply chain impacts that we've seen. As many of you already know, we were in a bit of a global supply chain crisis prior to this Russia Ukraine conflict. But we want to talk especially about what has changed since this conflict began and what areas are impacted globally. Russia and Ukraine collectively account for a pretty large portion of production globally, especially with regards to food and certain mining and energy. And all three of those are important categories. Russia and Ukraine together make up 30% of global corn production, which, corn is used as a product in so much processed food. And this is why it's such an impactful product to have any kind of shortage of. But on top of that, they also account for a very large proportion of global wheat and barley. Excuse me, I actually misspoke. It is not 30% of corn, it is 30% of wheat and barley production globally, which is arguably more important than corn. But it is a large percentage of global corn production as well as sunflower oil, not soybean oil. There was another oil. Canola oil. That's right.
But yeah, canola oil. And I mean, these are sort of staple foods that really everybody can use. And, not only people eat these in a wide variety of processed foods, but it's also commonly used as, feed for livestock.
Mm-hmm.
And like we're talking about with oils, there's just so many applications for these. And between Russia and Ukraine, like you're saying, like they produce such a large percentage of the world's usage of these actual crops and resources. So the impact that this is going to have on the global market is, quite large and far reaching when you actually start to think about it. And I mean, in particular, us here in the US, we're very fortunate in that we have such a large mass of land with such varied agricultural availability. I mean, in Florida and California, we can grow, oranges and tropical fruits, whereas in the Midwest in the US, like there's a lot of corn and wheat and soybean production as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, from the US standpoint, there's actually a wide variety that we have, self-sufficiency in.
Yes.
That we'll definitely feel the impacts of this effects on the global market, especially in the prices. But it's not like we'll have to do without corn for, months or years as this progresses going forward.
Yeah, and there are other impacts that we may see, especially in terms of like meat production, and dairy. Certain dairy production has taken like some serious hits in the United States in particular, and those products are affected by a wide range of issues, not just that ranging from fertilizer price increases to labor shortages in terms of who is working in these slaughterhouses and in these processing facilities. Some of that has been going on for 2 years now, since the pandemic began with just some of the early major outbreaks during the pandemic occurred in food processing facilities, and that 1 month, 2 month period was enough to stagger that production. And if you have that sort of situation in a otherwise smooth system that is kind of operating at optimum efficiency, which is typically how we try to operate things, you have major shortfalls that are often not materialized for months to years to come.
Yeah, and I mean, particularly over these past like 2 years, like I mean, like you're saying, there's this definite, couple months initially where it was, effectively stalled, if not stopped completely in some respects. And then it didn't really ramp up immediately either. As we had our own, pandemic restrictions and other nations around the world have been handling that, in their own ways. Like you don't have that immediate return to pre-pandemic production very quickly. Like that has to be scaled up slowly over time.
Absolutely. So, as you've probably already noticed by now, your prices at the grocery store are higher, but we should not see any extreme shortages or lack of availability of any of the food products that we typically consume. Some of the out of season available foods, I should say, that you typically have access to that are imported, those are goods that you may see not be hitting your store shelves for some time. But again, we want to talk about how this impact is a far more global impact, and regions that are closer in proximity to and rely on these imported goods, typically from Russia and from Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, in particular, like areas such as the Middle East and some areas in Africa where, like, like we were talking about before with Egypt, like
Hmm.
Egypt is not a place that's, very fertile at large. I mean, they do have the Nile River and there are a lot of places where they can produce agriculture,
Hmm.
but just due to their location and geography, it's very difficult for them to have as wide a variety of self-sufficiency as places like the United States or Great Britain.
And I believe food price and or just inflation on a broader scale was one of the larger catalysts in the Arab Spring as well. And typically, food price increases in particular correlate with political instability in some of these poorer countries, especially. It means regime change because people only tolerate going hungry for so long before they demand change in their locales.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely one of the most important aspects as far as the general populace goes. I mean, everybody needs food to eat, and the more difficult it becomes for working class or average citizens to actually be able to acquire that, the more rightfully upset, but also just engaged in what's going on at a political level, at more of the corporate levels, and just being involved in how do we fix this and change this. If you can't put food on the table, there's no reason for you to go to work.
Yeah, and I mean it's definitely worth considering from our perspective. We have not, most Americans in our lifetimes have not experienced any major lack of food. I'm not, obviously there are people in this country that experience food insecurity of sorts, but by and large, our population has not experienced that, and it's very hard to contextualize the fact that our entire civil society is kind of built on this fact that everyone has most of their core needs taken care of, or at the very least available to some degree.
Yeah, I mean, particularly here in the United States and, in many of the European nations, I'd almost argue all of them on some level have these welfare systems in place so that, those families or individuals who, have this food insecurity issue or, some other financial related dilemma regarding food or shelter, like there are systems in place in order to try and alleviate and assist with that. And obviously, those kinds of things ramp up, especially in high inflationary periods or, global shortages. But in places like, Sudan and Africa, and we're not really sure how this is going to affect places like Afghanistan, which has very recently undergone a regime change. And so, like, these areas in particular are going to be hit quite hard. And, almost the entirety of their population will feel this on some level.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is a really a humanitarian crisis that extends far beyond Ukraine's borders when you consider the ramifications of these food shortages. It's definitely going to be a crisis, and it's, it is important to consider that, and to for us to try to do what we can to alleviate this concern. But the challenging thing is that all countries are going to feel this pain to some degree, even wealthy Western nations, and those are the types of situations where humanitarian aid and other, any assistance that we would typically be offering to our neighbors and to even, countries that are nowhere near us geographically. Those are the times when that type of aid kind of falls to the wayside and, falls on these private non-governmental organizations to try and backfill that.
Right. And I mean, we've been kind of focused on like the commodities and more food prices, but we're also seeing, this high inflationary period, particularly in the US, but this is also happening on a global scale as well. Like there are a lot of nations around the world that are having remarkably high inflation compared to what they're used to. And so having these happen more or less at the same time, somewhat staggered as far as beginning and hopefully ending. But like these two problems are going to pile on top of each other, and everyone, I don't, it doesn't even really matter how much money you make. Like when you go to the grocery store, you're going to notice when your grocery
Yeah.
bill is 50%,
Unless you're so
100%
wealthy
more.
that you don't go to the grocery store for yourself, or like you're a U.S. congressman or senator, and you haven't set foot in a store except for a photo op, maybe.
Right, right. But I
Yeah.
mean, even in those instances, like you're still going to notice. It's not going to, affect your daily life if you're making 200, 400 grand a year. But at the same time, that's going to change your investment strategies. And,
Yeah.
the whole global financial system is going to be shaken, if not changed, by these events.
Well, it's funny you dropped that $200,000 to $400,000 range because I kid you not, this was not a satire article, but today I saw an article from, I believe it was from Forbes, stating that basically, like, I don't remember the exact headline, but it was something to the tune of, um, here's how inflation affects you if you make less than $300,000 a year. It's like that's their arbitrary cutoff mark, and it's yeah. I mean, it's sad because obviously $300,000 a year for an individual, I believe, puts you in the top 1% of income earners.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Maybe not for per household, but for an individual.
Well, yeah, I mean,
does.
for an individual income, that's definitely high income. And I mean, for broader society, I believe the average income, I mean, even in the US, is somewhere in the neighborhood of like 50 to 60,000. I don't even know.
I think
if
that's
it's that
household.
high.
I think median
Household.
individual income is somewhere around 30,000 US
That
dollars.
sounds about right.
Yeah.
But like when you consider 300,000, I mean, whether that's the household or an individual, like that's just a lot more money than is typically what people have, especially when it comes to, the gas station, the grocery store, just general commodities that are consumed on a daily basis.
Well, and it's important to point out that a lot of this current crisis that we're experiencing, especially with regards to this inflationary environment, is not solely due to this Russia-Ukraine conflict by any means. This is caused by a variety of factors, and you may get some disagreement from experts in terms of which of these factors has what level of impact. However, this is the cause of some of the artificial slowdowns and shutdowns in our economy that were caused as a response to the pandemic when we had little information and we didn't know exactly how to handle it. Virtually every economy in the world shut down to some degree or other. That was one of the factors. So that unplanned supply shock, and then on top of that, you have Western governments in particular, and Japan as an outlier, the monetary expansion that we've seen occur. Many people have seen these charts at this point, the M1 money supply of just how ludicrous it shoots up after March of 2020. And that was essentially our Federal Reserve taking certain policy actions to expand liquidity to prevent a recession. And that is something we're going to be talking about a little bit later here. But back to, just this global commodity shortage, which is caused by these, aforementioned factors. We are seeing it in so many sectors. I mean, like we could talk about the consumer price index to begin with.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that because, like, my understanding of the consumer price index is it's sort of the general, I'll call it, post in the ground that we use to gauge inflation over time and like clearly identify like recession periods or, bull markets, that kind of thing. But at the same time, the consumer price index lags behind the actual prices in the marketplace, right?
It does. It's not a very good predictor of the future necessarily, and it kind of allows it's one of those statistics, much like the unemployment numbers that we use, the U6 unemployment that we've been using for the last 20 years, I believe, a little over 20 years. It's kind of a misrepresentation of statistics because it is comprised of a basket of commodities that is supposedly what the typical household consumes, but in a vast and diverse nation like the United States of 350 million plus people, can you really say that there is any effective basket of commodities that can adequately explain what an individual household's consumption may look like?
I mean, absolutely not. And I mean, especially since like, the dot-coms of the early 2000s and the subprime real estate, issues in 2008 and like, just recently, like the commodities that people use on a daily basis change like year over year, really.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just think about how drastically our lives have changed in the last 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. You can go back any one of those number of periods, and we lived in a vastly different world. We needed vastly different things in order to, succeed. Like a smartphone may have been a luxury in 2006, but it's certainly not a luxury today. It's essential, I would.
But yeah, I mean, especially one of the key things that's kind of, I've noticed over these past couple years is just gas and how much, the average person versus individuals actually use gas. Because I mean, like we saw at the start of the pandemic, like due to lockdowns and more people going remote and just general lifestyle changes in relation to what was going on, like people started driving way less. And I believe like gas consumption was down like almost 30 or 40% for a short period there.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, that's part of the reason why we're in the situation that we're in. Even though, like we were talking about earlier, the United States is pretty insulated from a lot of like relying heavily on this global supply. We we have imported, we do import energy from abroad. Though the reasons for that is, it's questionable whether that's necessary to begin with, but it's also perhaps in part to preserve certain trade relationships and certain trade balances. That was something that is taken into consideration. And I mean, we obviously spited our closest ally and largest trading partner, Canada, by shutting down the Keystone XL pipeline, though it would not have been producing for several years and it would not, save us from this current situation we're in. Fuel prices have a very clear impact on people directly. Everyone notices it. And like you said, now that the economy has started to pick back up, we've seen mass reopenings, even in states that had more restrictive policies throughout the lockdowns. And just people are going back to normal, essentially. And they're going back to, right. It's bad timing because they're going back to normal right as they're experiencing these price increases.
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely feeling the sharpness of it, particularly now that people at large are going back to some more resemblance of normalcy. But at the same time, like we were seeing this throughout the pandemic as well. Like, I mean, I was looking at it just earlier today from the US Energy Information Administration
Mhm.
actually put out statistics, and from December of 2019 to this past December of 2021, gas prices rose $1.20 per gallon. And that's pre any Ukraine Russia conflict as well. And so like don't get me wrong, there's a substantial amount of price changes currently that's due to the Russia and Ukraine situation and
Absolutely.
due to those global marketplace changes, but these prices, particularly gas and commodities, have been rising pretty steadily for at least a year, if not longer.
They have. And that's one of those things that is not as much in the United States control as it was, say, 10 years ago. 10 years ago, especially due to our heavy involvement in the Middle East, we had a lot of influence to exert over OPEC nations, given the military aid that we were providing some of them, given our occupations in certain other countries that were oil producers, Iraq being the major one there. Um, given all of that, we had more leverage to play against Saudi Arabia, which is the largest OPEC producing nation at that time, and our political influence on those countries has waned substantially over the last decade, especially. But really, it's been going on for a little bit longer than that in terms of how long it's been waning. We can't apply the sorts of pressure that we had in the past to essentially order them to drill more and pump more oil out. And that's why, as you were saying, the prices increased during the pandemic was because they wanted to essentially profiteer off of the pandemic globally, knowing how instrumental they would be in restoring economic balance over time, and knowing that they were going to be getting less in sales. If they pump more, obviously the price is going to go down. They're going to make less money.
Well,
Um,
and like you were just talking about, like it's been waning for some time, but I think recent events, particularly the situation in Afghanistan and now the situation in Ukraine, is sort of exacerbating these issues to the point where, countries like Saudi Arabia and other OPEC countries aren't really seeing the benefit of siding with us. Like we've pulled out of Afghanistan. And so that's not a situation in which we're helping the diplomacy of that region. And so it's actually devolved to the point where Saudi Arabia is actually looking at selling some of their energy, particularly oil commodities, to China in the yuan instead of exclusively doing it in the dollar. Now, that's not completely changing the petroleum dollar standard, but
well, yes, I mean you're spot on with that conclusion. It is definitely a calculus on their part, considering the botched Afghanistan withdrawal, considering that our allies, perhaps more so than ever, feel less protected by their alliance to the United States than ever. Because even if there was no explicit, mutual security agreement between us and Ukraine, this is one of those scenarios where 20, 30 years ago, the United States would have been able to do something perhaps. It's obviously like it's challenging. You're talking about two nuclear armed states when you talk about the United States and Russia. Of course, you can't enter into conflict frivolously and you can't be careless in how you enter into conflict. And Ukraine is really shaping up to be potentially this large scale proxy stage of battle for some time.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's a really apt description, especially. I mean, we've seen more of the proxy-esque situations, particularly in, Middle East and the OPEC region of the
Syria.
world, and
Yeah.
Syria in particular. But like, we're seeing Ukraine as sort of this new proxy between essentially the West and, the East. And the East and the West look dramatically different than they did, 100 years ago. But essentially, the regimes are more or less the same. You have China and Russia and Japan and Korea on one side, and you have the European nations, the United States and Canada on the other side. I mean, it's remarkably similar to the previous conflicts over the 1900s.
I mean, it really is. The only difference is that China is not undergoing their own internal strife. So they would be a direct player and they would be the most influential player in one power block, potentially. And Japan is no longer Imperial Japan. So they would be on our side.
Well, right.
Along with South Korea. However, back to your earlier point about the threat of OPEC nations selling oil in anything other than the dollar. I think that's something that a lot of people don't understand. The fact that our purchasing power, the reason why we're able to buy such cheap goods from China, from all these countries that we buy imported goods from, is specifically because of the strength of the US dollar. And it's not called the petrodollar for no reason. I'm sure everybody's heard that term. And that is because OPEC nations sell oil exclusively in the US dollar. And you can speculate all you want about this, but all I will point out is that Saddam Hussein was a dictator of his country for many, many years with no U.S. intervention. The only time the United States decided to intervene in Iraq was after he began selling oil in the euro.
Yeah, and I mean, that in particular is a big part of the global economy, let's say, strain that we're seeing right now. I mean, when you can trade commodities, particularly energy, in exclusively the US dollar, the US is able to use the US dollars in order to buy commodities from all these other nations because they need those dollars to then buy the commodities that they need, and particularly energy in this discussion. But like, as you change that, and particularly when we're talking about this, Saudi Arabia is the most recent development in this area, but there are other nations that have been reviewing it and are definitely looking into it now as not no longer being exclusive in the US dollar. I mean, they will still trade in the US dollar.
Sure.
But the differences in that changes a lot of the global marketplace when the US dollar doesn't hold that high level of essentially use and esteem that it has had for many years now.
Yeah, and this is something that is not likely to materialize anytime, in the immediate future, but it is something that we all need to be concerned about, because if this global energy market is not powered by the US dollar, that is going to have a bigger impact on every single one of our lives here in the United States than anything else that's occurred in the past several decades. That will be staggering because we have offshored all of, not all of, but a substantial amount of our domestic production capacity. So we are heavily reliant on imports from the rest of the world. So if you want to talk about inflation, you would see real out of control inflation if a new standard was adopted, whether that be the yuan, whether that be the euro, whether that be a sort of hybrid system. And on the other hand, we talked about this the other day, you also have the potential for poorer countries spearheading a movement to move away from centralized systems because of all this instability and unexpected collapses that we've experienced over the last couple decades in terms of the United States market specifically. Global confidence in the dollar has declined a lot. So you have certain countries considering, like, what if we move to a sort of stable coin monetary authority of sorts?
Yeah, I mean, essentially it opens up the door for, new conversations in this domain. I mean, over, centuries historically speaking, there has been, a global standard currency, we'll say. And like, historically speaking, we had the Dutch trading companies, and then we had, the British Empire and the Spanish empires and the colonial
Hmm.
eras into the United States in the more recent, I would say 100, 200 years. And then, now we're in this era where we have other options such as Bitcoin or Ethereum or other cryptocurrencies and stable coins that are out there that, aren't controlled by any, nation or empire or really faction at all. And so they can be universally traded
Hmm.
between countries like this. And it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. I think it's definitely too soon to draw any
Sure.
conclusions, but myself as a technical person, I'm very, inspired and hopeful by some of the smaller nations, and particularly like El Salvador,
Yeah.
labeled Bitcoin as, actual legal tender. And like, that's huge for not only the popularity, but also the use of Bitcoin on a global scale.
Well, and Bitcoin has taken quite a dive in value since El Salvador adopted it. And shockingly, their president, I don't know how to pronounce his name, so I'm not going to butcher it here. He still has, supposedly, I don't know how legitimate the results of this polling is, but he supposedly has pretty high approval ratings in his country. Like, not, okay, I shouldn't say pretty high, like overwhelmingly high approval
Well,
ratings.
yeah, and I mean, like in particular, especially with just the recent events here of 2022, like that kind of makes a lot of sense to me, especially with sort of the results that we're seeing from the economic sanctions on Russia. Like, if you have the freedom to use these other tenders that can't be used as sanction, effectively instruments against you, then you have this sort of stable resource to go back to. I mean, there's a lot of, you know, discussions about hard currencies like gold and silver versus softer currencies like the dollar or the yuan or the euro. But at the same time, like you have this currency that's not well understood at large. I mean, technical people understand it better, but there's a lot of volatility in it due to the fact that it's new and not well understood. So I think it's very interesting to see how this is going to play out moving forward. But I'm very hopeful that, these decentralized cryptocurrencies will actually be very useful and, arguably essential in the global marketplace moving forward.
Well, and this just goes back to the conversation we had last week with Will here. Is this there is this war going on behind the scenes of centralization versus decentralization. Centralization is, of course, the current means of operating globally and pretty much in every level.
Well, and I mean, has been for,
Yeah,
a
I mean it's
long,
for
long
all of human
time.
history essentially.
Right.
Since we were living in caves and we're
Basically.
nomadic tribes hunting. We've moved towards centralized systems from monarchies to empires, and it is going to be interesting to see how that plays out because a trustless system that is perfectly auditable, which is what all cryptocurrency is a public ledger and a means of transferring arbitrary value, which at this point, all of our currency not being backed by any precious metals since 1972 is already kind of like in the philosophical sense, what is money actually worth? It is a completely conceptual thing at this point, and it is largely ones and zeros in a computer.
Well, yeah, but I mean, like the value that we give to money, especially since like the Nixon days when we were officially taken off the gold standard, like it's much more of a softer psychological understanding in that the U.S. dollar holds value because U.S. citizens, but also the world at large, believes that the U.S. will be around for a while. Like we do have very strong economy in many respects. We do have very strong military pretty much by every metric.
Yeah,
And like so those are the aspects which gives the US dollar its confidence and realistically its value in the long term.
yeah, that is going to be interesting to see how that plays out in the future because you have a lot of discontent, especially among the youth of this country, with regards to our extremely high military spending. Which, of course, I have my criticisms as well of how specifically the military spends money. Of course, I think it could be a lot more efficient. However, there's this fundamental lack of understanding, and I don't know if this is a failure of the education system or what, that our of the reasons why our system is able to function the way it does, and even of the way that money is created in this system.
Yeah, I mean, a big part of it is like I would argue that the biggest part is definitely education, and to some degree, you don't want the general populace to understand that thoroughly, and large part due
You
to
mean from the government's perspective?
from particularly from the government, and in my case, the military's perspective. I've done substantial work in
Yeah.
the DoD sphere, and so Department of Defense, for those of you not acronym sufficient, but like so you don't really like in a problem such as like the military industrial complex, and that like essentially on some level you just have to throw money at the problem.
Mhm.
And like that's a poor way of phrasing it, but at the same time the idea is you have to research new things. Like you have to be on the cutting edge at all times. So there's going to be a lot of money wasted. And so there's a trade-off there between it definitely could be run more efficiently. And I'll be the first to admit and say that it should be.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there are a lot of advantages that we as Americans have due to the fact that, you know, the military and the government at large spends an incredible amount of money on research.
Yes.
And so like there's a lot of discussions about that, but the sheer lack of understanding, I think, is largely intentional, but also the fact that it's really difficult to get youth in particular interested in finances. And so when you start talking about the military and finances, you're going to lose even more interest than you had at the beginning. So to some degree, it's difficult to bring that into an education system.
Well, and people are rightfully irate at all of the interventionist wars that we were not really consulted on, or the populace was largely propagandized into supporting. Even the Iraq invasion. At the time, there was overwhelming support from the U.S. citizens on both political parties for that invasion. However, if you were to ask people that question now, in light of all the information that's come out since, I believe people overwhelmingly don't support the Iraq invasion.
Yeah, I mean, in particular with the Iraq one, I'd say that's spot on. And like, you know, I would say one of the best and the most eye-opening comparisons that you can draw in is particularly the OPEC region is the Iraq conflict that we were involved in there, but also the Afghanistan situation. Because I mean, that kind of developed as we were growing up, and you know, is a little bit more recent than the Iraq situation. But even today, like the vast majority of people supported that because we were there for clear reasons, like terrorism, 9/11. Like there were real issues in the Afghanistan area that the majority of people were on board with it. Now, how we handled it, how long we were there, all of those kinds of things, there's obviously a substantial debate over, and rightfully so, particularly with the how we actually pulled out of Afghanistan.
Well, and you know, if most people were aware of the fact that we were propping up brutal warlords in order to fight the Taliban, we were arming other bad guys to fight the bad guys that we wanted taken out, and the fact that, you know, we had our soldiers essentially protecting all of the opium poppy fields that was then funneled to China, turned into fentanyl, smuggled into Mexico, and smuggled through our porous southern border. Like that is heavily a factor that contributed in the crazy amount of opiate deaths that occur in this country.
I mean, that was a substantial contributing factor for sure. I'm not convinced that is the issue. And in particular,
yeah, but do you think people would have been okay with the knowledge that we were occupying a country and
think
we're
it's
permitting that activity to occur?
I think it's more important that they don't have to care. And so there's a lot of people who say, you know, or who are focused on the reason. They're not interested in how it's going to happen. It's a different part of the world. And I think a lot of people understand that to some degree, the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of a situation. And, you know, the end obviously doesn't justify the means. But at the same time, we don't have the luxury, unless you are willing to send the United States military into armed conflict kind of thing. And so, particularly with the Iraq versus Afghanistan comparison, like in Iraq, we were the offensive force.
Yeah.
And like almost exclusively in the US military. And in the Afghanistan situation, we were primarily a defensive force for our interests.
Yes.
And we armed an external offensive force. And so I think there's a disassociation that happens, particularly in those conflicts. And we're kind of seeing this to some degree with the Ukraine situation. I mean, at large, the United States is obviously on the side of Ukraine in this conflict. But at the same time, I've never heard anyone say that we should send U.S. military over there. We're completely comfortable.
Oh, I mean, believe me, the neocon faction within government media is absolutely advocating for that.
There's definitely dissenting opinions.
Yeah.
And that's one of the drawbacks of a free society is people are allowed to have their own opinions, whether you disagree with them or whether they're just outright wrong and crazy. I mean, that's just one of the drawbacks.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we're far more comfortable sending goods, services, munitions without actually directly being involved. So you have that kind of disconnect in, you want to support this conflict, but what does that actually mean? You know what I mean?
Well, and like we've been talking about this entire time, lack of education and lack of information is a major factor here. A really interesting piece that was done by Sagar and Crystal of Breaking Points, released, I believe today, was they put up a poll that was done by another group, and this was done. It was blindly distributed to two groups, and one question was, "Do you support a no-fly zone in Ukraine?" And the other question was phrased more accurately, providing context, and said, "Do you support a no-fly zone in Ukraine?" Meaning that the United States would shoot down Russian fighter planes over that territory, potentially triggering war. It literally shifted from the first question, "Do you support a no-fly zone?" was 43% in support, 35% unsure, and then the remainder against. And the proportions completely swapped when you phrased the question differently. When you provided that context that, hey, do you understand what a no-fly zone is and what it means? And I've felt the same way from when it was proposed when we were in Syria, because it would have meant the same thing. Russia's involvement in Syria would have meant potentially war with Russia if we were to enforce a no-fly zone in our involvement in the Syrian civil war.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, like, that's a key indication of education, not in particular like the education system, but like the education in respect to like informing the general populace and this new age of, really weaponized propaganda that we have to deal with. Like, I mean, 20, 30 years ago, most people got their news by watching an hour of TV during the evening hours or whenever they were available. Whereas these days we can hop online and, process a wider variety of information much faster via social media, via, trusted news outlets or independent news outlets these days, that like it's not as unified or as clear what the information is. And so it's much harder to like nail down an actual baseline understanding that individuals or even groups have in these areas. And so like with the Ukraine situation, it's interesting, that poll in particular, like that experience of adding that context very dramatically changes people's opinions of it. Because like the first question, do you support a no-fly zone? Well, yeah, it's an armed conflict. You don't want bombs falling out of the sky. Like that makes perfect sense to me of why the 45 or whatever percent of people would be interested in that. But at the same time, then you add the context of like, we would have to do it and potentially spark war, and adding the context actually causes you to think about it and be like, well, no, I'm not actually okay with it in that type of a situation. Mm-hmm. And so like this new age of education is really becoming much more broader and ongoing education in the terms of informed populace versus the traditional education systems that essentially were designed to give you a baseline of, functioning knowledge.
Well, it's very interesting because some of the topics that we're talking about in particular, especially, economics and foreign policy and some of the higher level technology that we discuss on this show, those are not subjects that are taught in high schools. I mean, unless you are taking advanced courses, AP and IB courses are offered for some of these things.
I mean, even I took some AP courses in high school, and like even in my college courses, the vast majority of these topics are at best brought up, but
Yeah.
they're not explained or dived into to any substantial degree. And like a big reason for that in part is due to the fact that it's ongoing, and it's difficult to like do deep dives on some things like that are ongoing until
Absolutely.
after the fact. You get, more information comes out, you could do investigative journalism comes out, and books are written, and there's a lot more that you can kind of piece together a fuller picture. But at the same time, like, there's a lot of topics, particularly on the technical side of things, where you will hear the name of it, like machine learning, AI, neural networks. These are all like the media buzzwords,
Web
right?
3.0.
Web 3.0, exactly. And like, the new internet standard, they'll be brought up. But even at a college level, like, you don't dive into these topics until that's like your main course of study.
And
so,
your
like,
out-of-date textbook probably has a couple paragraphs about some of these like key important developments.
Right. And like in particular, like machine learning is typically taught, even at the college level up to bachelor's degree, I would say, is taught to students as a black box. Like, it's just this thing, and you feed it data and it gives you some output. And you don't actually dive into and learn how it works and the statistics and structures behind it and why it functions.
Even within an engineering program, typically?
Even within engineering. And so, I mean, there you are given the option to take like 1 or 2 classes, but in order to really dive into these like higher level technical topics, it's a graduate level course that you have to take. And in large part, that's due to this idea that education is a general understanding. So like for myself in engineering courses, like I had to take, mechanical engineering courses and general system design courses, and there's coding courses and all this kind of object oriented, different languages, variety of different aspects. And so when you're doing this like broad kind of almost, scattershot approach to education, you can't really dive in too deep into any one topic without giving up another topic.
Yeah.
And so something like neural networks and machine learning is so targeted, but also so new that it's not well understood. It's not seen as necessary for a baseline understanding. Like, if you're taught these ideas as a black box, like, you can use them, you just won't be able to actually tailor it and get the full benefit out of it, which is why then you have to go into these higher level areas where, graduate school, that kind of thing. And I think the same is true, particularly in finance, especially as we're discussing, a little bit earlier. And also this episode is like interest rates and the Fed's role and how money is actually used and created is not well understood.
Well, so that's what I wanted to mention, is even as far as the way microeconomics and macroeconomics are taught at the undergraduate level. I didn't spend a lot of time in college, but I spent enough time in college to have gone through most of my economics courses. And it's taught very poorly. It's taught purely from a theoretical standpoint with very little applicable case studies observed until you reach, like you're talking about, that graduate level study. But how many people are going into graduate level economics? Not very many. Well, obviously, unless they want to work in public policy.
I think that's one big problem, and particularly here in the United States with like the debt crisis. In particular, I'm referring to the student loan debt crisis at the moment, and like how expensive it is to go to college. And like this is one aspect where I think the Europeans definitely have a leg up on us in, free education, essentially, in that like as you graduate from high school, even if you don't need a college degree or whatever to do your profession or your career, like it is essential in this day and age to continuously educate yourself, whether that be,
absolutely,
a couple hours a week where, you read new articles and get up to speed on some new thing that you don't understand, or, advance yourself in an area where you are fairly well read. Like that's something that's not traditional from our own perspective here in the States, but is absolutely essential, especially with technology increasing and finances becoming more complex.
Essential if you really want to thrive. You can absolutely get by on just, and this is why there is so much incompetence at middle and even certain higher levels within the private sector and within government, is because people acquired a certain level of credentials and kind of failed upwards in their careers. And there's a lot of people that have done that. And we're really facing the impact of this large number of people that are perhaps in over their heads.
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, I mean, there's just so much going on in life. I mean, that's effectively why we created this show, is because there's just so much information out there. And in this day and age, everybody's got, a training course or their own material that they're putting out that you can pay for and purchase content from them. And like, there's a lot of good information that can be gathered there, but most people, myself included, don't have unlimited discretionary income to just buy whatever we want and spend time on it. Like, there's just not enough time in the day for that. And so to some degree, you do just kind of have to turn a blind eye to a lot of these aspects and just accept that other people hopefully are handling it, kind of situation.
Well, and I wonder where we end up in the future with all of this, because as we progress as a society, as our technology, as all these various elements of our society advance, the base level of information you need and training you need in order to be able to function within a certain role keeps increasing. I remember noticing this when I was studying for CompTIA's Network Plus and Security Plus exams some years back. I was looking at the level of content that had been added since the 90s, and I was just thinking to myself, I was like, man, how easy would it have been to get into the networking profession in the early 90s? I was like, I only needed to know this much. Now I need to know, substantially more information, because of all I have to learn from the beginning, every single development and stage that this technology went through in that process. And that's kind of where we're at. And I wonder where we end up in the future with that, with people already being so highly specialized, but needing to become even more specialized. Are we going to see people having to essentially train until they're 30 years old, 32 years old before they can finally enter their professions? I mean, already you see that in high level, like physicians and whatnot, are not actually practicing medicine in their field until after 8 years of med school and a 4-year residency and a year or two fellowship.
Well, so yes and no would be my response to that. In particular, your comment just now on residency, particularly for physicians. So a massive aspect of college, even at the undergraduate level, is working experience. And typically we refer to them as like internships. And like, nobody wants an unpaid internships. You want one where you're going to be paid some wage, right?
Of course.
But at the same time, the benefit you're getting is the work experience, because like, you can learn all the background knowledge that's out there theoretically and teach yourself till your 30s, 40s even, and still not know everything there is to know. But getting out in industry, like, no matter if that's just a couple hours over a summer break kind of thing, or whether that's, take a year off and do a full co-op with 1 or 2 classes sprinkled in, like, getting out into industry is how you identify while working those areas that you need to improve upon. And in particular with tech, like you mentioned with the CompTIA certifications, like, there's so many certifications out there right now that like, you would have to spend, a couple of months studying for each one. And every single year, those are updated with new standards.
Mm-hmm.
So like, for me to switch to a different aspect of technology that I'm, haven't been working in for several years, like, that's a several month long reevaluation process and bringing myself back up to speed. Like, I have been trained, has extensively educated in engineering, but I'm not fully up to speed on all the nuances of electrical engineering. I have essentially all the background, particularly because I'm a software computer engineer, but like, when it comes to renewable energy versus fossil fuels, there's a lot of nuances to that I'm not current on. In particular, like Tesla's battery improvements, like, that's changed a lot over the past like 2 or 3 years, let alone a decade.
Well, and that information is also probably proprietary, right?
To some degree. And so that gets into sort of a gray area, particularly in technology, but also manufacturing, in that patents and copyrights becomes a weird kind of tandem with educational knowledge, because it is not easy, but it's also not impossible to reverse engineer a patent
Yeah.
and create something similar. Now, that being said, typically a company won't put the patent out until they've established themselves in the market. And so that way, people know that they're the ones that created it and essentially have the best version of it, right?
Yeah.
But then once that information is out there and, more widely known, or for example, engineers leave Tesla, just, theoretical, and like they can take that knowledge with them, and that's confidential to some degree, but recreating a similar battery is not directly a breach of their agreement necessarily.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because we will have to have an entire conversation on intellectual property patents. And actually, I believe I can have an IP lawyer come in and have a conversation with us about that. That's definitely worthy of its own entire conversation because it's such a huge impact on how we develop, and even goes back to what we were just talking about earlier with regards to the US's defense spending and why we have to do that to a degree, as you argue, because we're at the forefront. We don't have the luxury of operating as China does and just stealing our intellectual property and kind of reverse engineering it and running from there. That's just the first mover problem, kind of within a space or a new development. But something that is not proprietary information and should be widely known by everybody is kind of how our monetary system works. It's really not that scary. I think people are intimidated by understanding it, but realistically, it could be explained. I believe it could be explained to a high schooler, no problem.
I think like definitely in like the junior senior level
Yeah.
of high schooler, or
Most, or maybe not all, but
but in particular, like any recent high school graduates could definitely be brought up to speed. I mean, I think the biggest hurdle just for myself, I mean, as a technological person who's, substantial college education, the actual linguistics of it really like posed an initial hurdle for me. And so I kind of kept putting it off for, a number of years, actually, till more recently. And so I was wondering if you can kind of walk us through, in particular, the Fed's latest interest rate hikes. I mean, they say 25 basis points, which for those listeners, basis points is 25 basis points is 1/4% on the interest rate hikes.
yeah, just another example of that jargon that kind of is off-putting to people when trying to understand financial terminology and economics terminology. And I mean, every industry kind of has this, but yeah. So when I guess I should go back a little bit first and talk about how you have our government and the Federal Reserve, which is not a part of our government, have those are two sides of the coin in terms of how we manage our economy. The economy is just being this abstract concept of human behavior and economic activity and the way it intertwines. But you have the fiscal policy side, and that is government spending, that is taxation, that is debt. That's not what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about the monetary side, which is governed by any central monetary authority, which in the case of the United States is the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve has recently taken action to raise interest rates for the first time since the pandemic began. The reason why this is significant is because if you're like a lot of people, you've been watching the stock market and all the craziness going on over the last 2 years and wondering why. I mean, maybe you're very happy about it, especially, a lot of people are quite happy about it. But it didn't make a lot of sense. If you were looking at it practically and you were saying, why is company X worth double what it was pre-pandemic when their sales have improved since pre-pandemic, but by like 10%? Why are they worth double that? Why are there some companies, Crocs is my favorite example of this, is at one point was worth like 13 times what they were pre-pandemic. And of course their sales improve when people are working from home, but it's one of those things where it's just truly absurd when you look at these valuations and you say, this makes no sense to a Warren Buffett style, traditional value investor or fundamentals investor. None of it made sense. And the reason for this stock market craziness was essentially the Federal Reserve. In an effort to prevent a recession after our shutdowns of the economy in the early stages of the pandemic, the Federal Reserve took a couple policy actions, and they really only have a few policy actions that they can take. They can change bank reserve and capital requirements. They can purchase assets, namely government bonds is typically what central banks will purchase. They will purchase or sell government bonds to impact the market that way, and they can also adjust interest rates, which the rate that they are adjusting is the rate that commercial banks have to pay the Fed for borrowed money.
So
that is not the rates that you and I pay.
right. So the Fed itself doesn't really create money. It's
No.
these commercial banks that are essentially creating money and loaning it out to consumers, whether that be for, leverage in a market account, or whether that, for the broader society is your home loan or your auto loan. And in particular for the United States, student loans are affected heavily by this.
That's correct. I mean, maybe you've never asked yourself this question, but when you go get that $300,000 mortgage from your bank, have you ever wondered, where is this money coming from? Well, where it's coming from is the bank is creating this money in that moment when they're issuing that loan to you. They are creating that money. And that is not money that existed previously in the economy. And there are certain limitations that exist on how much money banks can create. And, and they have various risk calculations that they make internally. And there's also certain regulations that we have added that were necessary. I mean, the Dodd-Frank Act, which, many people may have heard of especially if you've watched documentaries on the 2008 Great Financial Collapse, you would have heard of the Dodd-Frank Act reforms, and those significantly increase the reporting requirements for banks in terms of how they handle their liquidity and their assets.
So in particular, I think it's a good time to talk about that 2008 subprime mortgage time period, because that was essentially the first period and essentially has started this era of extremely low interest rates that we've been in for quite a few years now.
Yeah, so that was after the Great Financial Collapse of 2008 was the first time that United States that the Fed's that the federal funds rate hit zero, was in the aftermath of that as a response to that. We also took on unprecedented, at the time it was called, and this is one of those things that I hate in terms of the naming of this terminology. It's intentionally done so that people don't ask questions or don't understand what it means. But the Federal Reserve called it quantitative easing, which is a really nice euphemism for we're effectively, we're purchasing toxic assets from the banks and we're suppressing bond yields and we're enabling the creation of more money. We're trying to and of course, the rationale behind it is perhaps a good thing. We were coming out of a recession. Granted, this was a recession that was the cause of failures on not just one party, but a number of parties. Really, that's one of those details that is kind of overlooked when talking about the 2008 recession. Is it was not just the greedy bankers, absolutely greedy bankers capitalized on it and did not pay consequences for it. And that's one of the things that's interesting in terms of what we're experiencing right now is arguably some of the systemic risk that we face right now is because of the lack of government action that was taken in the aftermath of 2008.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect example. And like we kind of mentioned a little bit before, is like the senators and politicians who are paid, hundreds of thousands of dollars, being able to make money on the stock market and other influences that they have, essentially insider knowledge of, is a big area of contention. And particularly the rhetoric around this from the political standpoint is, all we have to do is, disclose the trades that we're making. And then, now people are getting more accustomed to the idea of, no, that's not okay. If I, as a civilian, were to do that, I would be heavily, heavily penalized, fined, and
we'd
may
go to
even
prison.
Yeah, I mean, we'd straight up see prison time depending on the severity of it.
Yeah, insider trading is a federal crime that sees prison time. And obviously, like you're saying, members of Congress, their families are exempted from these insider trading laws, essentially. And so has previously the Federal Reserve Board of Governors and staff. However, that has recently changed. So the Federal Reserve, due to certain political pressure, has drawn back their policy of reporting on certain trades and has outright banned members of the Federal Reserve from making certain types of trades. We will see if that extends to Congress as well. I think a lot of people want to see that happen because you don't want to see public servants profiteering off privileged information.
Right. And I mean, in particular, when it comes to, Congress and especially just the federal level at large, like you're a public servant and your job is to serve the general populace, not profit off of the knowledge that you happen to gain in your position.
Absolutely. I mean, public service, my opinion is that if it comes with some sacrifice, that's what it means. You should not engage in that, in seeking those positions if you are not, ready to accept some level of sacrifice to do that. And sadly, those positions have become so influential and have become a gateway into high paying positions after retirement from politics. And unfortunately, that's just what we've seen is people going into high paid cable news anchors or into high paid consulting gigs or something of that nature afterwards, corporate board positions.
So yeah, I mean, there's definitely some conflict of interest, particularly at the federal level. But I want to get back to these Fed interest rates and really what the short term and also the long term effects that we're going to kind of see from this
Yeah,
are.
absolutely. So we've covered what the actions the Federal Reserve can take. But like you said, Glenn, earlier, consumer price index is a lagging indicator. So what we were getting at earlier with regards to CPI being usable by politicians to kind of misrepresent what's actually happening. What happened essentially when inflation first started to rise, and mind you, many people were sounding the alarm bells. Like these are more fringe voices, not really mainstream voices, largely people in independent media and kind of more fringe blogs and whatnot were talking about the risk of future inflation. I myself was talking about it at that time and writing about it. Um, but we looked like we were crazy people because I'm talking around March to summer of 2021. And around that time, the economy was really looking like it was picking back up major steam. Things like were looking good. Vaccines had been released. It was looking like COVID was going to be a less serious concern than it had been in the prior year. And you had all of this economic optimism, and people had been sitting on a cushion of savings that they'd accumulated from not spending money, not going out the way they were, from working at home, from not driving as much. Most people, anyway, within the economy, especially highly paid people within the information sector of our economy.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, particularly just those industries in which you don't necessarily have to be, at your job. Whereas, like, to some degree, factory workers were reduced and weren't able to do as much production. But at the same time, the factories were largely open throughout the majority of this time period. And, like, you know, especially in 2021, like, at large, people were going back to the office. And those people that, didn't need to and could work remote were essentially exactly where they were throughout the majority of these past few years. And so we did see this like big, essentially bull rush last year where, this new confidence and return to normalcy kind of like started building up and affecting the markets, but also prices. But we also did still see and kind of really get a handle on more of these supply chain issues that we're still having this year as well.
Absolutely. And this all ties in together. You have all of this excess demand that we started to see spring back into action from like around last March into last summer. That really caused an impact on the already strained to recover supply chain that was still in the process of trying to recover. And, one thing that I don't want to downplay, the number of fatalities that were caused by the virus. However, another significant factor that people don't really consider, other than the number of people that we lost, is the number of people that chose to retire due to the pandemic. 5 million people retired. An absolute record number of retirements occurred in the first year of the pandemic. And I think that was 3.5 million higher than estimated, if my numbers are correct on that.
Yeah, I mean that definitely sounds as an accurate estimate. I'd have to check the numbers myself. But I mean it's definitely kind of what we're seeing and like what the media likes to talk about, whether that be independent or, more traditional media outlets of this, great resignation period of like, there's a substantial amount of people, like you're saying, who are retiring, far more than we've really ever seen before. And at the same time, a lot of people were taking advantage of this pandemic era period in order to switch positions. Maybe that was, due to other lifestyle changes and, they weren't happy with their job.
Oh,
or
absolutely. And having to watch
re-education.
kids, having to assist with education for kids in the home. And, there's a lot of factors, people's health concerns, people who are immunocompromised, not being able to return fully to work. Um, yeah, all of this kind of plays into this really great transition in our economy, and how this relates to interest rates and why they're being raised right now is, and this is the criticism of the Fed, is that should this action have been taken last March to last summer, sometime around that period, I was advocating for this. I was saying you have to steadily raise interest rates and stop this asset purchasing and stop the stock market from going out of control. Not that I want to see the stock market fail in my own country, of course, but these artificial, ridiculous valuations that you started to see were concerning because it also really changed the landscape of who owns what in this country. You know, you had financiers and investment firms, family offices, hedge funds, all of these various institutions, private equity firms. You had them having way more access to capital than they previously had, and you had ordinary people, or even if you were middle income or higher income, having maybe a little bit more access to capital through the financial system, but not nearly on the level of these investment management firms.
Well, in particular, that's one of the interesting things going on right now, particularly with this, extremely high inflation that we've been seeing, which is likely even higher than, we're being informed about due to the
Absolutely.
consumer price index. But along with that, the Fed increasing these baseline interest rates for the banks, like that's increasing the cost of getting a loan for a car
Yes.
and a house, and particularly student loans here in the US. But these affect variable interest rate loans the most. Whereas like new fixed loans will be impacted by
Yes.
this.
But if you are somebody who is already in position, already had a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, you're fine. I
Yeah.
mean, you're not really worried about this. This inflation kind of benefits you, frankly.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Especially to some degree, the fact that your interest rate is fixed and it's
Mhm.
not going to change as a result of this. But at the same time, one of the things that I want to point out is this time period in particular, it's very beneficial to anyone who has assets.
Yes.
Whereas,
to somebody who is leveraged for assets.
so who has assets in particular, but also if you have been leveraged previously,
Yes.
the more leverage you could take advantage of, the more you benefited from these lower interest rates.
From these lower interest rates and from the ongoing inflation that's going on. And that's why you have this dual economy of sorts. You have lower income people and younger people in particular who are extremely harmed by this current situation. And then you have people who are middle income or higher income and, own real estate and are in their 40s or 50s or 60s. They are in a much better situation from this. And many of them, in fact, benefit greatly from inflation because while, yes, their short term, some of their immediate costs will increase depending on how far they were leveraged. Like I'm talking somebody who's leveraged, who owns a primary home and owns, a second piece of real estate, say, and they keep that as a rental property. Those people are going to be doing extremely well from this because their cost to service their debt, assuming it's fixed rate, is going to be extremely low.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like effectively, they can price in the costs from this inflation and of the new interest rates because that's what, the markets around them are doing due to, people still buying new houses. People always need houses, kind of a conversation. But at the same time, inflation essentially makes your debt cost less, particularly if you have assets. And like these assets accumulate value and don't lose value due to inflation, whereas inflation particularly affects your available cash or monetary resources to spend.
Absolutely. And as we're talking about this, some of you may have some alarm bells going off in your head about who benefits the most from this inflation. Well, the U.S. government does. The U.S. government has obviously an extreme spending problem. I'm sure a lot of you have turned on gone to that website of the U.S. National Debt Clock and just seen how much our debt and our deficit has grown. And for most of us, our entire lives. I mean, the last time the budget was balanced was under Clinton, roughly around the time we were born.
Yeah,
basically.
around the 90s.
Yeah, so it's been a long time. We've only seen a country with a spending problem essentially, and I'm not going to get into the theoretical debt to GDP ratios that can be sustained and whatnot right now, but bottom line is the national debt also gets devalued as our currency gets devalued.
Absolutely. And I mean, this is definitely at the governmental level, this is a bipartisan problem. Like, both Republicans and Democrats, for as far as I can remember, and I'm, basing this off of some research as well, that like likely even further into the past, like there's been a lot of spending, especially
Absolutely.
at the federal level. And so periods of high inflation like this particularly benefit the government in being able to pay off that national debt essentially for cheaper.
Well, it lets them kick the can down the road further because, many people in our generation and in Gen Z and, future generations will come to recognize they don't have a lot. We don't have a lot of confidence in the reality that Social Security will exist in any in the form it currently does, at the very least, by the time we're actually reaching retirement age. It's widely understood that Social Security is a Ponzi scheme that requires continual growth of the population and of the economy in order to sustain itself. And that is not happening anymore in Western developed countries and in the East as well, in developed countries, Japan and Korea. Populations are contracting. The birth rates have dropped. We have aging populations and we have a smaller workforce. And really, this is one of those things that policymakers try to correct with immigration. But the levels of immigration that you would have to have in order to even facilitate that are astronomical.
Well, and at the same time, this isn't exclusively, the problem of any one nation. I mean, we're seeing it particularly due to, recent generations in particular, but this is essentially happening in large part around the whole world. I mean, there are nations in Europe as well who've started to notice this, essentially to some degree, it's a social transition from, the days of, the older, United States mindset of, the farmhouse, have, 6 to 10 kids wasn't all that uncommon. Whereas, these days it's becoming more and more common to have, less than 5 kids, sometimes only 1 or 2
Oh, I mean,
kids.
the average in Western developed nations, developed as we call them, nations is, I mean, it's well below replacement rate. Some
Absolutely.
countries are worse than others. I mean, you have certain Scandinavian countries. I don't recall which one. Is literally putting out advertising. The government is putting out advertising, encouraging young couples to go on vacation because they did a study that found that young people are more likely to conceive a child when they go on vacation. It's like they're like when your government is telling you like, hey, go have kids, please, like go on vacation and get frisky. Like it's
That's at the very least, that's an indication of a problem.
Yeah, it is a problem. And, people have varying opinions on this. A lot of people are absolute cynics and believe that, well, I've heard a number of very intelligent people say, well, I don't want to have kids because I'm concerned about the environment. I'm concerned about the future of the environment.
Well, yeah, I think that's a transition that's kind of been happening more recently is, I mean, over the past couple decades, I heard so much talk, especially at the intellectual levels, in particular in university, but also at large, of like this, worry of overpopulation. We're overpopulating the planet. And in some respects, there's some truth to that. But over the large part, there's still a lot of room on this planet.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, the offset there becomes, what can we make up for in technology? Because these new technologies that we're developing, for one, we don't really understand them that well until we finish researching and actually developing them and see what they can do. I mean, in particular, the internet, like that made the world much smaller in that we can, converse with you from all over the world, wherever you are. But at the same time, the world didn't actually lose any landmass. And, that's a weird concept to consider.
No, I'm losing it right now because I remember, I think it was Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize winning economist, said at the, I apologize to Paul Krugman if it was somebody else, but I'm 95% sure it was Paul Krugman. He said something like, in a decade's time, we'll find that the internet was no more revolutionary than the fax machine.
Oh, yeah.
This was in the early 90s. This was said.
Well, and, right. I mean, like, that's a perfect example of like the early 90s, even the early 2000s. Like, you could never have envisioned what the internet has become now, and it's still not done evolving.
No, we still don't know the lengths that connectivity can facilitate and what it can create. Yeah, it's absolutely mind-boggling the fact that we have no great way of predicting what sorts of technological advances and what impact they will have. Yes, we can talk about some of the theoretical stuff in terms of where are we going to be, where do we estimate we're going to be in terms of processing and computational power and memory and battery technology within X number of years. But there are any number of breakthroughs that could happen that could absolutely revolutionize our understanding of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, like, those are going to have, completely unknown impacts. And, we can speculate on them essentially until they actually, arrive. But like quantum computing's a new recent example that's already made big waves in optimization and logistical type situations. But we have no real grasp of what that means from, our real understanding of physics. Like, we're still understanding physics at a quantum level, let alone what we can do with that from a quantum computing or application standpoint. So if there's any of these areas that you're interested in, we can do a deep dive. I know people in the technical field, people in manufacturing, industry and finance as well. If there's anything like this that you're interested in, feel free to let us know. That'd be great feedback for us to have.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that is one of the reasons why I reached out to Glenn and we decided to start this show was because I had a number of people reaching out to me for answers on some of these topics. Whenever something major would happen in the world, whenever something that was not widely understood would occur, there has been this move towards independent media sources, and it's been great. Of course, it's been bad as well in certain situations. A lot of people have risen to prominence within the alternative independent media scene who are propagating a lot of misinformation and a lot of lies.
Well, yeah, I mean, whether intentional or unintentional, it's just important to recognize the agenda that the provider of that information has. And
Absolutely.
so, particularly in our case, like, we're just essentially trying to provide you with information, and we have our areas of expertise that we're very knowledgeable about. And I love talking about and sharing that with as many people as I possibly can. And it's not taught well enough, I think.
Absolutely. And we definitely are sharing our opinions here a lot, but we try to be explicitly clear when we're sharing our opinions versus when we're describing, how a system operates or how, like, something that is factual.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And like, one of the things that, me and you have noticed just in these past couple episodes is, like, we try and point out what's explicitly our opinion and what's conceptualization or speculation on trends and concepts that we're seeing. Because, as much as you study something, none of that is, essentially set in stone. So many different variables are changing over time. And so, the best we can do is point out our opinions and do to the best of our ability explain what we understand about these concepts.
Sure. And that's what we're doing here is we're having a conversation. This is not a lecture series. If we want to make a lecture series, it would look completely different. We are doing a lot of pondering. We're doing a lot of thinking in real time about some of these concepts ourselves. And we have a little bit of prep. We do have plenty of conversations, as colleagues, and with other people as well. But yeah, in its entirety, this is a collective learning process of sorts for all of us. And we'd like for you to participate in that as well. Any of our listeners who, like Glenn said, are interested in hearing about a particular subject, if it's within one of our areas of expertise or we know an expert in that field who we can have on as a guest, and it could be a learning experience for us too, that's exactly what we want to do here.
Yeah, absolutely. And like and subscribe. Let us know if there's anything you'd like us to do a deep dive in, or something we've brought up that, you didn't felt like you understood or would like more information on. I'd be more than happy to do that in the tech space. I know you'd love to do that on some of the financial sector as well, in particular with the Fed and financial policies. But this is very much a more musing and speculating and concepting what we're seeing and what's going on. And if I hesitate to say this, but if you're interested in a lecture on certain topics, we're going to have to get some whiteboards and workshop that a bit. But
yeah,
I would
we
not
do.
be opposed.
I mean, we're still in the very early stages of this. Is episode 4, and we don't know what we're doing. We just started trying to figure this out like a few weeks ago. So, we definitely plan to be equipped to be able to put graphics up on the screen as we're talking about this in real time. We're going to be changing our setup a little bit in the near future, and just have that capability to be able to put up data for you to look at in real time. Um, so you don't have to be, and we might start including sources in the video descriptions and whatnot, just to provide that context so that you have that understanding that we're not just pulling we're not just pulling numbers out
Yeah.
of nowhere.
Yeah, this isn't out of thin air. We
Yeah.
do research. We're constantly sending stuff to each other, bringing
Yeah.
each other up to speed on what we're seeing and talking about and kind of workshopping this. But we very much like this kind of a fluid conversational setup. So let us know any thoughts or opinions you have on that. And thanks for listening.
This has been Esoteric Artifacts on YouTube, Spotify, and on Apple Podcasts at the moment, as well as Google Podcasts. Let us know, though, if there's any other platforms you'd like to see us on. Thanks.